Good morning and welcome to class 10 of our series on the second letter of St. Paul to the Corinthians. I'm Father Patrick Cheng, the theologian in residence at St. Thomas Church, Fifth Avenue, and it's wonderful to have you join us. Today is the fourth Sunday of Easter, also known as Good Shepherd Sunday. And so today's gospel reading comes from the 10th chapter of the Gospel according to St. John. And part of the gospel reading today is Jesus said, "I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hired hand, who is not the shepherd and does not own the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and runs away. And the wolf snatches them and scatters them. The hired hand runs away because a hired hand does not care for the sheep." I thought that today's gospel passage is especially appropriate for our passage today, our chapter from 2 Corinthians, where St. Paul is responding to the super apostles, the outsiders that come into Corinth and are arguing against him and stirring up the Corinthian church. And in many ways, what Paul is saying is that these super apostles are not so much like Jesus and the Good Shepherd, but rather they are like the hired hand in today's gospel reading. That like the hired hand, they come in, but the moment that the wolf comes, the moment that there's difficulty, they actually don't stay with the sheep. They leave and they run away. And so I invite you to think about Good Shepherd Sunday, this gospel text, and in particular, Paul's comments and criticisms of the super apostles in today's chapter of 2 Corinthians, as we listen and go through this very important text, including the full speech, which is an important part of 2 Corinthians. And so I invite you to say along with me the collect of the day. O God, whose Son Jesus is the good shepherd of thy people, grant that when we hear his voice, we may know him who calleth us each by name, and follow where he doth lead, who with thee and the Holy Spirit liveth and reigneth, one God forever and ever. Amen. So we continue with our journey through 2 Corinthians, and today is the 10th class out of 12 classes. So we will soon be done with 5/6 of this course and this letter. And as I've mentioned, the overall theme of this letter is St. Paul defending himself against attacks from the church in Corinth and attacks from outsiders, including these super apostles, which many of you have asked about. And today, finally, we will get to learn a little bit more about them. As I mentioned last time, the theme from last week was defending one's ministry, Paul defending himself. That's the overall theme of this letter, but especially starting with last time, chapters 10 and the beginning of chapter 11, all of Paul's, all of his statements in this last chapter were about defending himself. And in fact, he will be continuing to defend himself through the end of this letter. And also, starting with last time, there is a dramatic change in tone that this letter up until chapter 10 was fairly calm, fairly ironic. In fact, Paul had been very happy about how the church in Corinth had reconciled themselves to him. And he had even talked in chapters 8 and 9 about the collection for Jerusalem, asking them for money. And so everything was nice. And then all of a sudden in chapter 10, the tone changes and Paul gets very upset. And some people have said perhaps that's an indication that the end of this letter is actually a separate letter that was tacked on. I tend to disagree. I think it's important to look at this letter as a whole. In terms of ancient rhetoric, it may be that Paul was sort of buttering up his audience and sort of saving the best and the most his firmest lecture towards the end. And so today we continue with this dramatic change in tone. The key points from last time was Paul starts off with a bang in terms of talking about the metaphor of waging war. He talks about that he wages war by God's standards, the standard of the gospel, and that he attacks the rhetoric of his opponents, not so much like the sieging of a city in terms of Roman warfare, but really using the gospel to attack secular rhetoric or secular philosophy. Paul also acknowledges how the outsiders, the super apostles, have attacked him for how he looks and how he speaks. And he says that things aren't always what they seem. Paul also mentioned his desire to spread the gospel to regions beyond, his calling, his vocation as evangelist, and also taking the chance to criticize the super apostles for coming into what he thinks of as his territory, that they came into evangelizing the Gentiles. And he talks about his desire to spread the gospel to regions beyond, which may be an allusion to his desire to go to Spain, which he talks about in his letter to the Romans. And then Paul reminds all of us that we must boast, but only boast in the Lord and not boast in ourselves. Again, a swipe at the super apostles. And finally, a warning not to be deceived in the same way that Eve was deceived by the serpent. He is concerned that the Corinthians are being deceived by the super apostles. So that's a summary of chapter 10, the beginning of this downturn, this beginning of this very emotional part of the letter to the 2 Corinthians. In this time, we go into what is called the fool's speech. And this is part of chapter 11. And next time, chapter 12, is this famous section called the fool's speech, where Paul acknowledges that he is a fool, but he is a fool for God. He is a fool for Christ. And unlike the usual fool, what his speech is actually goes to God's foolishness, which is actually wisdom. And we will see that Paul refers to himself as a fool, and Paul talks a lot about his boasting. And it's really, he uses irony, right? That he calls himself a fool. He says that he's boasting, but he's actually not. He is proclaiming God's word. And the real fools are these super apostles that have come in to stir up the Corinthians. So the agenda for today's talk is chapter 11. We did the beginning last time. Today we will talk verses 5 through 33. It's actually a very long chapter. There's a lot about Paul's suffering in there. And so we will go through the chapter, but you'll see there's a lot to cover. But basically the themes in this chapter are, one, who are these super apostles that we've been hearing about for a long time now? We'll finally learn more about them. Paul's refusal to be paid for his ministry. That's actually a point of contention between him and the church in Corinth. And Paul addresses this, why he refuses to be paid by the Corinthians. We'll also hear about how Paul says that these super apostles are really like Satan's servants. He minces no words here. Paul will talk about how he boasts as a fool, as we mentioned, and the fool's speech begins here with a long description of Paul's suffering, both physical as well as internal and emotional. And then Paul ends this chapter with a reference to his escape from Damascus, escaping in a basket through a window. And we'll talk a little bit about why this is an appropriate way to end this chapter. And then we will finish, and then we will have our usual Q&A. So this is our proposed agenda through chapter 11. So first, let us begin with the super apostles. These people these outside agitators that come into Corinth and that Paul believes are stirring up his beloved church of Corinth. So this is the God's word, plain English translation, if you will, of the beginning of the 11th chapter of 2 Corinthians. Paul says, I don't think I'm inferior in any way to your super apostles. Even though I'm not good with words, I know what I'm talking about. Timothy and I have made this clear to you in every possible way. So what's interesting is that we notice that Paul begins with a reference to these super apostles. In the Greek, he uses the word huperleon, apostolon, huperleon, apostolon. And so in the Greek, this word huperleon is actually a word that Paul pretty much coins himself. We don't find this in other Greek texts. It's really meaning super, super great, super awesome, right? So huper means beyond, and leon means exceedingly. So it's not just exceedingly, it's beyond exceedingly great. And he's completely being sarcastic here, right? So understand, he's not saying they're super. He's saying that they think they're super. So you should think of super apostles as being in quotes, right? The huperleon apostolon. And he's saying that I'm in no way inferior to these super apostles, preeminent apostles. And he says, look, I may be untrained in speech, right? And the Greek word for that is idiotes to logo. So you may recognize idiotes. That's where idiot comes from. Idiot comes from the Greek word for being untrained or being an amateur. So there isn't the sense of like, how idiot means today. It's really that Paul is saying that unlike a rhetorician, he's not formally trained in speech. So he's not into all this flowery language that presumably the super apostles were. He is an amateur, but he is knowledgeable, right? So he talks about his gnose. So he may not be trained in speech, logo, or rhetoric, but he does have knowledge about God and Christ. Certainly in every way, in all things, we have made this evident to you. So he comes right out and names that he's not inferior to the super apostles. And he acknowledges his untrainedness in speech. So the huperleon, as I mentioned, is the huper, which is beyond, and leon means exceedingly. So it's the best of the best. And he uses it in this very ironic, sarcastic kind of way. And then, as I mentioned, the idiotes, he refers to himself as idiotes, as unskilled and an amateur in speech. And again, I mentioned that, he acknowledges that he's not trained in classical rhetoric, right? Paul had a rabbinic training, as we hear in the book of Acts. But, in the Greco-Roman world, rhetoric was super important, right? The notion of making speeches to make your case in a court of law or making your case before a governmental body like the Senate. Rhetoricians were the rock stars of their day. I remember my patristics professor, my professor of early church history, saying that in the same way that we have musicians and celebrities, the celebrities of ancient Greek and ancient Rome were rhetoricians, right? These people who knew how to speak, how to use language, and took years and years of rhetorical training. They were the rock stars, and they were paid a huge amount of money. And this will become relevant later, that if you were appointed a rhetorician, today we think, that sounds kind of boring. How much could they make? Well, these people were the ones that made almost more money than anybody else, right? And so to be a trained rhetorician was actually a very prestigious and well-paying vocation. And Paul comes out and says that he's not trained in that. And as we mentioned last time, Paul acknowledges his shortcomings. This photo, for those of you, this photo illustration was a historian who tried to reconstruct what Paul would have looked like based on biblical and extra biblical texts. But Paul's own shortcomings, as you may remember last time in chapter 10, verse 10, he says, for they say his letters are weighty and strong, but his bodily presence is weak, meaning that Paul says that he knows people say that he's kind of ugly and his speech contemptible, right? So they actually comes out and says that his speech is of no account, right? And so again, Paul acknowledges that this is not his strong point. And so one question for you, just thinking about this text, is that to what extent have you misjudged someone, right? That, for example, if someone like the super apostles that are so smooth talking, and they come in and they seem so accomplished and have such great credentials. But, unlike the Superman, they're more like a Clark Kent, more like a bumbling Clark Kent inside, right? And vice versa, right? That, you might have, for example, you might have a Clark Kent here that looks bumbling on the outside, but really is a Superman, a super person inside, which I think Paul is saying that that's what he is. How many of you have had that experience of misjudging? And not only sort of in the outside world, but even in the religious or spiritual world. This is something that's really appropriate for all of us. And that is what Paul is getting at when he talks about these super apostles. Secondly, Paul then goes straight on and addresses the issue that he's been criticized for his refusal to be paid. Throughout this letter, there are allusions to the Corinthian church and the super apostles criticizing Paul for actually not being honest with money. And there is some kind of allusion that he's actually skimming money, and he's actually making himself seem all great because he's not getting paid. All right, so this is an interesting thing that Paul talks about. He goes, "Did I commit a sin when I humbled myself by telling you the good news of God free of charge so that you could become important? I robbed other churches by taking pay from them to serve you. When I was with you and needed something, I didn't bother any of you for help. My friends from the province of Macedonia supplied everything I needed. I kept myself from being a financial burden to you in any way, and I will continue to do that." So remember, Paul is writing here from Macedonia. He is writing to the Corinthians about when he had visited the Corinthians earlier, when he had founded the church earlier, and he expects to see them again. But he says to them, "Did I commit a sin?" And he uses the word sin, the hamartian. It's a very strong word. "Did I commit a sin by humbling myself," the tapenon, "so that you might be exalted," right? That you may be hypsothete, to be exalted, "because I proclaim God's good news, the euangelion, free of charge, dorean, free of charge, without payment." Right? "Did I sin by not charging you for my preaching?" He said, "I robbed other churches." And he uses this esulesa. It's a strong word, but again, Paul is being sarcastic throughout this section, just like he calls the super apostles super. He doesn't really mean they're super. He's sort of using extreme language, like "I robbed other churches." Chances are they probably accuse him of robbing other churches, but he's saying, "I robbed these other churches," right, by accepting support from them in order to serve you. And so he's sort of saying that, that he humbled himself in order that, that they may be exalted. So these words, the dorean, which is to be without payment, to give services for free. And remember what I said about the rhetorician, right? Earlier, Paul said, "Look, I'm not trained in rhetoric." And if he were a rhetorician, he would have been making all this money, right? But not only does he not make a lot of money, he's actually giving his own services away for free, which was a scandal from the perspective of the Corinthian church. And this word sulao means to plunder, right? So this idea of, not only just taking, but really plundering the money from other churches. Again, he's being sarcastic about that, alluding to what they're accusing him of. And this idea, you may remember that he talks about his humbling himself so that they could be exalted. Well, where have we heard this before? Well, of course, in his letter to the Philippians, the kenotic hymn, where he describes Jesus emptying Jesus's self in order to then raise and exalt us. So emptying himself in the incarnation, that Jesus humbled himself, became obedient to death on the cross, and then God exalted Jesus, resurrected him, and so that we could be exalted also. So Paul is alluding to, in the same way that Jesus was humbled and exalted, that he too humbled. So he humbled himself by not taking money so that he could exalt the Corinthians. And so he goes on to say, and when I was with you and was in need. So when he was with the Corinthians and was in need, I did not burden anyone, right? So this word, the ketenarkesa, he didn't want to burden anyone, for his needs were supplied by the friends who came from Macedonia, right? So basically, remember Paul was working as a tent maker, basically as a leather worker. So he had a day job, right? In many ways, a lot of us priests now, we've got day jobs and we work on Sundays, out of necessity for some of us. Some of us have callings in multiple places. But this whole idea of being a tent maker, a minister who does other work to fund the minister's preaching and ministry, is called a tent maker, because Paul was a tent maker. And he did this, and when he ran out of money or didn't have enough money, actually other of his other Christians from Macedonia, perhaps like Timothy and Silas, came to give him money. So rather than asking for money in Corinth, he actually got money from other churches that he had evangelized before. And he said, so I refrained and will continue to refrain from burdening you in any way. Now, some of you might be saying, this is kind of odd. Why does Paul feel so strongly about not taking money from the Corinthians? And he basically had a rule that wherever he was doing ministry, he would not take money from those places. One is because that, he wanted them to focus on the gospel message, and only when they were converted or when they had heard the word that they would feel like a voluntary need to give, not out of some sense of obligation. But more importantly, also, as you'll see, that in the ancient Greco-Roman world, there was this notion of the patron and the client, that basically there were patrons that had people of a lower class that they would actually sponsor and give money to. And in return, the client would actually do favors for the patron. And Paul really wanted to make sure that his relationship with the Corinthian church was not something of a wealthy patron and a poorer client, because then the client would not be independent, right? The client would be beholden to the patron. And so this is the reason why Paul did not take money from the Corinthians. And so we have the word to burden, the kata narkao. Notice that the word here, narkao, is the same word as narcotic, to be numb. So it's almost to be burdened, to be numbed by the burden. He did not want to burden the Corinthians, right? And so, as I mentioned, Paul actually served as this tent maker, that his day job was to make tents with Aquila and Priscilla, his friends. And so during the day, he would be a leather worker, make tents and other leather type things. And then he would preach also to the Corinthians. And that gave him financial independence, right? This is why it was so important to him, because he was not beholden to the Corinthian church. The mindset of the Corinthian church, and I suspect the mindset of wealthy churches everywhere, is that fine, I'm going to give to the clergy all this money and wealth, and I'm going to expect something in return. Just in the same way in the secular world, I have a lot of money, I buy things, I get things in return for my wealth. Why would this not happen in the church also? And Paul is saying basically, no, that's not how it works. That you may give money, but I need to be independent. I need to be financially independent from that. And this is what I mentioned, the patronage system in the ancient Greco-Roman world. This is really important to know from a sociological perspective. The emperor was the ultimate patron, and every class would have clients that were below them. And so the patron literally provides goods and services and food and commerce and security and a community structure. That's where the whole medieval notion of serfdom comes from, right? Where we had serfs. And then the clients in return would give praise and adoration and would provide loyalty and pay taxes and also give votes to the patron when they were running for public office. So there was very much an exchange for money and goods. the patron gave that to the client, and the client in return would provide adoration and votes and do things and actually show up every morning. This idea, you sort of see this, in movies where you'd have sort of royalty or you'd have wealthy people, and all these people would show up in the morning to ask, to ask what they needed, and line up outside. I mean, this patron-client relationship was exactly what Paul was trying to avoid. And that's why he didn't take money from the Corinthians, right? So he was rejecting this patronage system. And by rejecting it, he was rejecting basically sort of the norm, what Corinthians were used to. And so not only were they really surprised by that, many of them were actually offended by that. And so, that's why Paul is defending himself here. And so because they were offended, the Corinthians accused Paul of being untrustworthy with his money, right? They're saying, look, the only reason he's rejecting money is he's pretending to be so holy, but in fact, he's taking money. They alluded to the fact that, this collection for Jerusalem, well, he's probably skimming money from the collections. And so he's not trustworthy, right? And so this Jerusalem collection, earlier in this letter, Paul is very careful to say that, no, he's not going. He's actually sending other people, other trustworthy people that are known to the churches to be his proxies for this collection so that, that he can be above reproach, that he can be blameless, all right? So that sort of explains the financial undercurrents that's going on here. And so one question for you in terms of reflecting about the text is, have you benefited from financial independence, right? In what circumstances has being free from, the chains of financial bondage, if you will, been beneficial to you? I don't think it's an accident that after I was able to pay off my law school loans, I was able to go to seminary. I mean, I was fortunate that I was able to have some degree of independence. And I left sort of the law firm world, right? I mean, there is a sense of once you are financially independent, you can be more free in doing what God has called you to do. And perhaps you have experienced that. Perhaps you might be in a position where you are not able to be independent, and it is hard for you because you are financially dependent, especially during this last year and with, COVID and the economic challenges of this last year. That may also be something to reflect upon and pray about. And so I think Paul's writing about the economics of the church in Corinth is something that is really real and something that is relevant to us today. We continue with Paul's, well, I wouldn't really say tirade, but his very strong, speech where he starts talking about Satan and Satan's servants here. It gets really juicy here, where he is equating the super apostles with Satan's servants. It's getting really worked up here. So we hear Paul saying, as surely as I have Christ's truth, my bragging will not be silenced anywhere in Greece. Why? Because I don't love you? God knows that I do love you, but I'll go on doing what I'm doing. This will take away the opportunity of those people who want to brag because they think they're like us. People who brag like this are false apostles. They are dishonest workers since they disguise themselves as Christ's apostles. And no wonder, even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. So it's not surprising if his servants also disguise themselves as servants who have God's approval. In the end, they will get what they deserve. So let's take a look at this text here, where Paul is saying, as the truth of Christ is in me, right? The aletheia Christou, the truth of Christ, this boast of mine, the boast, the kaukesis, we've heard a lot about this word boasting. The boast of mine will not be silenced in the regions of Achaia. And remember, Achaia was the Roman region of Greece. And he's saying, why won't he be stopped from boasting? Normally, boasting is not a good thing, right? We sort of encourage us not to boast. And he's like, I'm not boasting because I don't love you. I do love you, right? He uses the agapo, the agape word for love. He's saying that I'm continuing to boast because I want you to compare my boasting with the boasting of the super apostles, right? The super apostles want an opportunity to be recognized as our equals, right? Just as we are. Kathos kai hemes. So do you understand? Paul is saying that the super apostles, they think they're wonderful. They boast by, worldly standards, right? That they say how great they are, how trained they are in speech, and how knowledgeable and what great ministers they are. And in fact, not only are they equals, they're even better than Paul. And Paul says, wait, they're boasting, let me boast too. And you'll hear what Paul is really boasting about, which is a different kind of boasting. So again, the kaomai, the word to boast, as I said before, if anything, the second letter of Paul to the Corinthians, one of the key words for this letter is boasting, right? That boasting in the Lord, not boasting by human standards. And then, as I mentioned, the kathos kai humes, as our equals. Paul is saying, look, I can step up to and I can be the equal of these super apostles. And in fact, he later says that he exceeds them. And we'll see what he means by that. And then he says, for these boasters are false apostles, right? They're false apostles, the pseudapostoloi, the pseudo apostles, the deceitful workers, the ergatai, erga means work, right? The ergatai dolioi, deceitful workers, and they're disguising themselves as apostles of Christ. They're in disguise, and this very, very long Greek word, right? The meta schemati zomenoi. So say that once again, meta schemati zomenoi means to disguise themselves as apostles of Christ, as apostolus Christou. And so, they're disguised, no wonder, because Satan, Paul says, Satan disguises himself. And again, you have this long word, meta schematizetai. Satan disguises himself as an angel of light, angelon photos. Remember, Satan is a fallen angel, right? And angels come from a world of light versus the darkness of Hades, of hell, where Satan is. Satan disguises himself. So it's not strange if his ministers, Satan's ministers, and here he uses the word diakonoi, where we get the Greek word, the English word deacon, servants, but not so much deacons of the church, but Satan's deacons or Satan's satanic ministers. They disguise themselves as ministers of righteousness, right? The diakonoi dikaiosunes. Dikaiosunes means righteous, servants of righteousness. So the satanic ministers also disguise themselves as ministers of righteousness, and their end, their telos, will match their deeds, erga auton. So here is the word, the meta schematizo, to change appearance. You have here this wolf in sheep's clothing, this idea of changing appearance, and it's not surprising, right, that Satan changes his appearance because Satan tricks Eve in the Garden of Eden by becoming a serpent. This is where we heard last time, right, that Satan's deception of Eve, Paul was analogizing the deception of the super apostles with the Corinthians, to Satan's deception of Eve. And then Paul continues by saying, but, and in last time he says in, chapter 11, verse 3, that he says, but I'm afraid that as the serpent deceived Eve, right? The office, the serpent, exepatisen, huan, that the serpent deceived Eve by its cunning, that he's afraid that the Corinthians' thoughts will also be led astray from their sincere and pure devotion to Christ. And then, as I mentioned, Paul uses this really interesting phrase, the angelon photos, the angel of light, how Satan disguises himself as the angel of light. And I said that, as we know, Satan is a fallen angel. But what's really interesting is that scholars think that there is this extra canonical book. It's apocryphal, not the apocryphal biblical text between the Old Testament and New Testament, but an apocryphal Old Testament text in the pseudepigrapha. It's a text called The Life of Adam and Eve that, if you ever wondered why in Genesis you don't really hear about Adam and Eve other than Abel and Cain after, sort of the the fall, there's this extra canonical text called the life of Adam and Eve, where apparently Satan then, after the expulsion from Eden, comes to Eve again and tricks her, tries to trick her again. And it says that Satan was angry and transformed himself into the brightness of angels. So some people think that this reference in this work, The Life of Adam and Eve, is a further reference to Satan as an angel of light, because Paul talks about Eve being tricked earlier. And so Satan went to the Tigris River to Eve and found her weeping there. So very interesting, just a sort of a scholarly side note. And then the diakonos, the servant, the minister, is just basically the Greek word for servant. That's where we get deacon and to minister. And Paul's notion that these super apostles are actually servants of Satan. And so, one thing to think about here is, to what extent have you been deceived by people who are disguised, right? Again, this sort of leads to last time, whereas appearances may be deceiving. And so, being wise to the possibility of deception. Now we sort of get closer to the fool's speech, where Paul talks about his boasting as a fool. And so we go here, and Paul says, again, I say that no one should think that I'm a fool, but if you do, then take me for a fool so that I can also brag a little. What I say as I start bragging is foolishness. It's not something I would say if I were speaking for the Lord. Since it's common for people to brag, I'll do it too. You're wise, so you'll gladly put up with fools. When someone makes you slaves, consumes your wealth, seizes your property, orders you around, or slaps your faces, you put up with it. I'm ashamed to admit it, but Timothy and I don't have the strength to do those things to you. So Paul is actually, again, being kind of sarcastic and snarky here. He's sort of saying that, look, I'm going to brag and I'm going to be a fool. Why? Because you put up with fools, that all these super apostles, they're doing all these things to you. They're making you slaves. They're consuming your wealth, and you put up with it. So why wouldn't you put up with me? And quite frankly, I'm not as weak. I don't have the strength. I'm weak, so that I actually won't do things like that to you. Weak, in quote marks. So this goes back to 1 Corinthians. You may remember the foolishness of God, going back a year when we started our online journey with Paul in 1 Corinthians of chapter 1, verse 25. For God's foolishness, right? The moron tou theou. Foolishness here, moron. That's where we get the word moron from. Moron tou theou. God's foolishness is wiser than human wisdom. And God's weakness, again, the asthenes, we'll see weakness here too, is stronger than human strength, right? This is a powerful, one of my favorite verses in all of Scripture. God's foolishness is wiser than human wisdom, and God's weakness is stronger than human strength. Well, Paul is going to say his foolishness and his weakness is wiser than the wisdom of the super apostles and is stronger than the strength of the super apostles. Paul says, I repeat, let no one think that I'm a fool. Here, not so much moron, but aphrona. But if you think I'm a fool, then accept me as that. What I'm saying is that, as a fool, there are a lot of people who boast according to human standards. He's referring to the super apostles here. It's the kalkontai kata sarka. You've seen the word sarka. Sarka means flesh, literally, but it also means according to human standards. So these super apostles are boasting according to human standards. They're doing what we do in modern day New York society, that we boast of money, we boast of real estate, we boast of not just wealth, but societal privilege, right? We get the best seats, all this boasting, that's all boasting according to human standards. Oh, we come from the best families, we have the best friends. He's saying that, they're boasting, but I'm going to boast too. So this word aphron is the Greek word for foolishness, right? Paul is saying that he is a fool, and this is where we get the fool speech from. And he's saying that, the Corinthians and the super apostles are boasting according to human standards. The kalkontai, kalkaiomai, meaning boasting, kata, according to sarka, which is the flesh. So they're boasting according to human standards, the lifestyles of the rich and famous, if you will. And he's saying, you shouldn't mind my being a fool, because you gladly put up with fools, being wise yourselves. Again, he's being a little sarcastic here. And then he's saying, anexis the, putting up with foolish people. And then he talks about all these things that the super apostles are doing to him. And he's saying, to my shame, the atimian, I'm too weak to do this to you, right? And we saw the Greek word for weakness. And he says the the ne come in. And so this anekomai, to endure, right? He's saying, look, you endure all this foolishness from the super apostles, so you should be able to endure my foolishness and my boasting. And here are the acts of the super apostles. I won't go into all of these words, but if you want to come back to the video later and to read the Greek text, these are the things that Paul is accusing of the super apostles of doing, right? Of enslaving the Corinthians, taking away their freedom, of devouring them, sort of this notion of being, a gluttonous and taking from them and devouring them, taking advantage of them, grasping, that's where lambane means, being presumptuous, being snobbish towards them, right? Like looking down on them. And then literally slapping them on the face, the prosopon on the face, and striking them, whether it was literal or just sort of metaphorical. These are the things that he's saying that not only are the super apostles doing, but the Corinthians are putting up with it. So why would they not put up with Paul's foolishness? And then the astheneo, this word to be weak, right? Astheneo is the Greek word to be weak. And Paul's saying, look, I'm a fool, I'm boasting, and I'm weak, and I'm proud of it. And so another thing for reflection is, how have you been taken advantage of, right? Paul is talking about the super apostles and how they're boasting, but they are in fact taking advantage of the Corinthians. And so that's something to think about again. Now, this is a very long section. And again, I will move through this relatively quickly about Paul's suffering, the shipwrecks, all the kinds of flagellations and the beatings that he's taken. This is an entire litany of suffering. So if you want to know just about every Greek word for suffering, come back to this part of 2 Corinthians. Again, when I think of 2 Corinthians, I think of clay jars, I think of boasting, I think of foolishness, and I think of suffering. And so again, there are a lot of really great Greek words here. We won't go into all of them, but I invite you to come back and ponder this if you're interested. And also to think about the suffering of ministry as related to the suffering of the cross, that the two things are connected, right? And not suffering for its own sake and unmerited or suffering, like the suffering that so many of us have borne over the last year and so many around the world now. I mean, you look at the news and COVID-19 is by no means over. We have friends, from India and the suffering that's taking place there. I think this reflection on suffering is timely. And you may remember that earlier in this letter, in the 4th chapter, verses 8 through 9, Paul says that he is squeezed but not squashed, bewildered but not befuddled, pursued but not abandoned, knocked down but not knocked out. This is a paraphrase, but saying how hard it is to do ministry, right? That there is suffering, but he stood up to these challenges, right? And earlier in chapter 6, he talks about afflictions, right? The afflictions of being borne down by heavy weights, hardships, and anxieties. He goes on by talking about beatings and imprisonments and riots. These are all things that you heard before. You saw these slides before, right? Toil, sleepless nights, hunger. These are all things that he talks about, and he talks about again. He reminds the Corinthians of all of the sufferings that he's done. And that's his boasting, right? That's the interesting thing. He's saying, look, the super apostles are boasting about how wonderful they are. I'm boasting too, but rather than boasting about how wonderful I am by earthly standards, by human standards, by standards of the flesh, I'm boasting about the suffering I've undergone for the gospel, right? You want to talk boasting? This is boasting. And so he's saying, whatever other people dare to brag about, I, like a fool, can also brag about. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they Abraham's descendants? So am I. Are they Christ's servants? It's insane to say it, but I'm a far better one. I've done much more work, been in prison many more times, been beaten more severely, and have faced death more often. 5 times the Jewish leaders had me beaten with 39 lashes. 3 times Roman officials had me beaten with clubs. Once people tried to stone me to death. 3 times I was shipwrecked, and I drifted on the sea for a night and a day. So pretty dramatic, right? I mean, this is like Paul is really going into his suffering for the gospel. This is where scholars think the full speech really begins. He's talked a lot about being a fool, and this is really the beginning of the full speech that will continue next week into chapter 12. And I really love this painting of the fool. It's a painting by a Polish painter, 19th century, Jan Matejko, and the painting is called Stanzik. Stanzik was a very famous court fool, a court jester in the Polish court during the height of the Poland's power. And this is a painting of his being really, unhappy and introspective while the court, you can see on the right, is rejoicing for their political victories. The fool who is supposed to be happy and carefree and silly on the outside is really actually deeply reflecting on the inside, whereas the rest of the court is joyful, but they don't see the import or the gravity of the situation. And so in many ways, this is a wonderful image to talk about Paul's fool speech, right? He's calling himself a fool, but he's speaking, in great gravity about what it means to be a fool for Christ. So, and as I mentioned, to be a fool for Christ is to be countercultural. The beautiful reconstructed Roman Corinth that was only 100 years old, that was wealthy, a port for trade, that had, the Isthmian Games, second only to the Olympics, and just was this wonderful place. He was being very countercultural. So Paul says, whatever anyone dares to boast of, again, the word of boasting, but here the tolma, I am speaking as a fool. I also dare to boast of that. And he's saying, are they Hebrews? So this gives you a clue as to who the super apostles are. He's saying, are they Hebrews? So am I. And so he uses, the Greek word Ebraioi, Hebrews. And here he's talking about ethnic identity. So Paul says they're Hebrew, they're ethnically Hebrew. So am I. Kago, right? Are they Israelites? The Israelitai. And again, not just ethnicity, but religious identity. Are they Israelites by religion? So am I, or at least Paul was, right, before. And then, are they descendants of Abraham, sperma, seeds of Abraham, Abraham? Again, sort of the theological notion of covenant. Are they descendants of Abraham? So am I. So he's saying, look, they're bragging about how they're ethnically Hebrew, they're religiously Israelite, and theologically they're descendants of Abraham. Paul is saying, I've got all of that, right? And so this gives you some clue as to who the super apostles were, that they were people coming from the Roman province of Judea, where Jerusalem was, and they were going to the Roman province of Achaia, which is Greece. And that sort of explains why earlier on Paul is talking about mission fields and how he wants to go to missions where other people have not gone before. I think Paul is really offended that these super apostles are coming to Greece when that's not where they're supposed to go. Not only that, but they are false teachers. But this gives you some clue as to who these super apostles are. Now, some people might think, is he talking about sort of other apostles, right? Like Peter and James. And most scholars think not, because he's so harsh about these people that these are likely false teachers, like the Judaizers in the letter to the Galatians, right? And so Paul says, are they ministers of Christ? I'm talking like a madman. He's right, the paraphronon. Like right now, he's acknowledging that he's frothing at the mouth, if you will. He's like he's on a roll and he can't stop. He's like, I'm a far better one, and with far greater labors, imprisonments, floggings, often near death, right? So here, the paraphroneo, to be besides oneself. He's like, look, I acknowledge I'm besides myself now, talking about these super apostles. And here are more words about suffering. So I invite you to take a look at this later. But he's saying, I'm a better minister. I'm a better servant than they, because I've been subject to labors, the kapois. I've been subject to imprisonments, right, the phylakais. I've been subject to beatings, the pelegais, and I've almost experienced death, the thanatos. So he's better for that. He can brag about that. He's like, 5 times I've received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods, stoning, shipwreck, drift at sea. What is this 40 lashes minus 1, right? What is this tesseraconta paramian? Well, so this notion of tesseraconta paramian, 40 lashes minus 1, 39 lashes. In the book of Deuteronomy, there is a permission for blasphemy that one can be lashed, receive lashes 40 times, but not more. So if you lashed someone 41 times, you yourself would be subject to lashing, right? So it was really harsh that if you miscounted. So the tradition was that if you were lashing someone 40 times, you'd actually do it 40 times minus 1. You'd never go beyond 39, just in case you miscounted, right? So that way you would not go over 40. So to say that you've received 39 lashes or 40 minus 1 is a reference to Deuteronomy. Other trials. So here again, other suffering. Paul was beaten with rods, he received stonings, he was shipwrecked, and he was even set adrift in the deep water. These are all these things that Paul said. And frankly, these are things that we actually don't even read in the Acts of the Apostles, right? That we hear about one shipwreck, which happens after this, on Paul's way to Rome. So clearly Paul had experienced other shipwrecks. We hear about a stoning, of mob violence of sorts. Beaten with rods, that's probably a Roman punishment as opposed to the lashes, which was sort of from the Jewish perspective. But again, all these things that Paul talks about, we don't really read in Acts of the Apostles. And so Paul then keeps on going, right? He's just sort of besides himself. Because I've traveled a lot, I faced dangers from raging rivers, from robbers, from my own people, and from other people. I faced dangers in the city, in the open country, on the sea, and from believers who've turned out to be false friends. Because I've had to work so hard, I've often gone without sleep and hungry and thirsty and gone without food and without proper clothes during cold weather. And take a deep breath here. Besides these external matters, I have the daily pressure of my anxiety about all the churches. When anyone is weak, I'm weak too. And when anyone is caught in a trap, I'm also harmed. Right? So he's just giving you lists of stuff that he's gone through. Like this is his boasting, kind of like a perverse countercultural way of boasting, unlike the super apostles, right? So here, the key word here, I'm not going to go through all this, is the word danger, the kindunois. The kindunois dangers, you see it pops up over and over again. He experiences all these dangers in his ministry, right? So the kindunos is the Greek word for danger. And this is an example of all the dangers that he talks about, dangers from rivers, and then all these dangers from people, from robbers, from his own people, the Gentiles, and then dangers from places, whether it's the city or the wilderness or the sea. And again, sort of from false brothers or false friends, you see in this picture, backstabbing here. These are the dangers that Paul experiences. And then toil and hardship, the kapo kai moktho. These are all physical hardships that we already heard about earlier in the letter, being sleepless, being hungry, thirsty, without food, cold, being naked. And then also being under pressure, internal suffering, right? Pressure, the epistasis, and then anxiety, the merimna, the anxiety of loving the church of Corinth. He's basically saying when he sees that the church of Corinth is weak, he himself becomes weak. And when he sees that they stumble, here the Greek word is skandalizetai. That's where scandal comes from, right? A horrible scandal is when you stumble. When they stumble, he burns, right? The NRSV translates it saying that, am I not indignant when you stumble? But really the Greek word, which you don't know unless you see the Greek, is the pirumai, to burn with indignation. And so that's where you get pyro from, right? So he's burning when he sees that they stumble and they sin. So not only are there external hardships, there are internal hardships. So the toil and the hardship, the kapo kai moktho, and then the pressure that he feels, the episustasis, and then also the anxiety, the merimna, And then when he sees his beloved Corinthian church stumble, the scandalizo, the scandal of stumbling, the stumbling block, he burns, the puroo, he burns with indignity, or he's upset by that, right? Indignation. And so again, as we get to the end, I ask, you hear all this suffering from Paul. How have you, in fact, suffered from your faith? In some ways, we've lost the sense of suffering. To be Christians is to be really comfortable in our culture, but it's not the case in so many places around the world. So I ask that you think about this. And then finally, I close with this notion of Paul escaping from Damascus. He closes with this very odd little story. After all this talk about dangers, right? He talks about escaping through a basket, through a window. And you're sort of like, well, why is he concluding by that? That's kind of odd. And so basically, this is the end of the passage. He says, if I must brag, I will brag about other things that show how weak I am, how weak I am. The God and Father of the Lord Jesus, who is praised forever, knows that I'm not lying. The governor under King Aretas put guards around the city of Damascus to catch me. So I was let down in a basket through an opening in the wall and escaped from him. It's a kind of odd way to end this, very long passage. Well, so he's referring to Acts 9, verses 23 through 25, where you can see in the picture, he escapes, from through this window in a basket from Damascus, and the disciples took him by night and let him down through opening the wall, lowering him in a basket. And so he's saying that I'm boasting about weakness, right? The astheneas. And one of the weaknesses is this escape, right? And so again, weakness, asthenia. It makes sense to talk about weakness because, as I mentioned, in Corinth, you had the Isthmian Games, which is second only to the Olympics. So everything was about races and competition and winning, right? Victory. And instead, he's talking about being humiliated in defeat, right? Leaving. So he's saying in Damascus, the governor guarded the city and I was let down in a basket through a window in the wall, the tekus, and I escaped from his hands, the exel of fugon. And so the tekos, the wall, he flees, right? The ekfugo, he is fleeing, running away, as opposed to standing up to things. And I end, the reason why he ends with this is it's an allusion, I believe, to the Roman siege warfare. Remember we talked about the Romans, how their warfare had to do with tearing down city walls, right? They would put holes in the walls so that they could go in and conquer a city. And so their warfare was to go into the city. But Paul's warfare was the opposite. Rather than to go in, they wanted to sneak out, right? Someone just put in the chat, yeah, Paul's warfare is to get out of the hole in the wall, not to create the hole, right? So he is humiliated, and yet he is bragging about that. And so I end by saying, have you ever boasted of your weakness in the same way that Paul does, right? I think it's hard to admit that we are losers in many ways, but Paul is sort of saying it's okay to do that. And in fact, his sense of loser is really winning in Christ's eyes. So the key points for today: value knowledge over rhetoric. It's more important to know Christ than to speak, in sort of flowery terms about Christ. It's important to be financially independent. Like if you can support yourself so you don't have to be beholden to other people financially, it's a good way of doing ministry. Beware of Satan's disguised servants. Satan is still disguising himself, and Satan's servants are also disguising themselves. And then Paul is proud to be foolishly boasting about all his suffering, all these words about suffering. And Paul is proud to be foolishly boasting about his weakness, about running away, escaping, and not engaging in warfare. So here we have it. We have covered most of chapter 11, super apostles, Paul's refusal to be paid, Satan's servants, Paul's boasting as a fool, Paul's suffering, and Paul's escape from Damascus. And so as always, I invite you to revisit the recording from the YouTube channel, as well as previous recordings. And next time, we will continue with the full speech, but we will also look at Paul's reflection on the third heaven in chapter 12. So thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention. I invite you to look back on this again. There's so much richness in this chapter. and have a wonderful week. And I will see you next time. God bless.